to us about Waldorf education and all the gems it brings. So thanks for coming out, and enjoy.
I just want to say, yeah, indeed, thanks for coming out. I know time is probably the most valuable thing in our culture, and you coming in, listening to what, some gems about Waldorf education, a little bit about what it's about, and maybe what your children experience in the classroom. Hopefully it will enliven you a little bit and leave you a little bit less curious about this phenomenon called Waldorf education. When I was thinking about what to talk about, because one could talk about lots of things when it comes to Waldorf education, a certain experience kept on coming back in my mind. And I lived in Asia for quite some time, and I did martial arts there. And after I got to know my teacher for a while, we had conversations about teaching. And one thing he said kept on coming back to me as I was preparing for this lecture. He said, any good education needs three things. It needs a good system, it needs good teachers, and it needs good students. And he said, there also has to be good timing. It's just stuck with me, and it's, 9, 10 years later, and it's still kind of floating around there. And I thought, when one reflects on Waldorf education, one can actually come up with a nice little lecture just looking at those three different aspects and how they work in our school here and how they work in Waldorf school at large. And I think the other thing is with that, you could also, and this is where he was pretty clear, you could actually do that for anything. And it could be for healthy and unhealthy purposes, like a good system. There's lots of good systems that may not perpetrate necessarily healthy things. So he said, what's the overall goal? So those three things with a goal. And really the goal of Waldorf education is to create humane individuals with the ability to impart meaning on their own life and give meaning to their own life and really bring health to the world. If I could say number one thing, that's it. And what does it mean? It's kind of a big arbitrary comment, health, but we'll delve into it a little bit and maybe walk with a sense of what it means and why it's so important in Waldorf education and why it's important to the teachers and why we educate towards it. So starting out, I just thought I'd look at what's the system that we use. Well, the system is Waldorf education, and when one looks at and thinks about it, it's interesting. It was created by this guy 100 years ago, and that's kind of an odd thing. You think, well, with all the latest research in neuroscience and all of that, what could a gentleman 100 years ago have that perhaps we don't have today? And I think what's interesting about him, and I think what's interesting, what he did with his system, what is quite unique and amazing, is his fundamental book is called The Philosophy of Freedom, and really what it is he observed and lived with his own consciousness and saw how it operated and how it developed, and he started watching other people. And in a way, you could say it's kind of a science of consciousness. That's what he looked at. That's what he observed. And by doing that, he started noticing developmental aspects about human beings, how our humanity develops. And through that, he thought, well, I've got this knowledge. Then he started looking at children, and he started thinking about school systems, and he said, well, if we're going to educate humane individuals, we have to understand how we work, how our own consciousness works, and how it develops. And then he started developing different tools and techniques and ideas around trying to create a school system that brings our humanity to the forefront. And that's really what it is. And you could say he used, people call it Goethean approach, which really is just phenomenological. Basically just watching himself, seeing how he operated, right, is how he came up with a lot of his observations, and then watching people too. So the system, there's a couple different components one can break it down to, and everything he does is with the intent of affecting our consciousness and affecting the children's consciousness in a certain way. And it starts with simple as the classroom. When we are in different buildings, in different settings, it actually impacts us. Now we as adults have the ability to kind of block a little bit more. Children, it's not so. They're very easily influenced by the surroundings around them. So he even had architecture, and he had ideas about how schools should be designed. Lots of natural lighting, beautiful work up on the boards, beautiful paintings on the sides. And so really what it does is create this nice sensory impression for the children, because it enlivens us. And you can imagine being in a room totally filthy and dirty, maybe with horrible lighting, no natural lighting at all, and think, well, how does that impact your consciousness? So it starts out in just a simple thing like that. How are the classrooms designed? So if you look at the classrooms, massive windows, letting lots of light in, allowing that look towards the outside natural world on occasion when one wants to have it. So that's an important aspect. moving on from there, it even goes down to the planning. So as a teacher, where does my planning begin? And what am I thinking about? So in the summer, as a teacher, one of the first things you'll do is just start reading about the developmental period of the year that you're going into. So for example, if you're teaching grade 7, he has a lot of different essays that talk about how the children develop. And you really kind of imbue yourself, what is grade 7? Like what is it their consciousness is going through, and how can I help them do that? And so you really just pour yourself into that, reading the different literature, thinking about it. And as you do that, you start looking at how are you going to carve out your entire year. Now what's neat is you have these blocks. And what's interesting about the blocks is when one looks at them, is there's actually what we call outward-looking blocks and inward-looking blocks. And it creates this nice rhythm of looking in, looking out, looking in, looking out. So when I start, I think, well, when they come back from summer, what block is going to get them engaged, bring them in from that kind of summer consciousness where they're out and kind of floating and living in the world around them? And I'll start out with a block that's either like geometry, form drawing, something like that. That's not academically intense, but it requires kind of a calm, gentle concentration. And if you do 2 weeks of that, every morning you come in, you do that precise drawing, maybe working with some geometrical figures, it really kind of brings them into the point that now I can start looking at different things. So maybe then I'll go into a history block. And the history block may be looking at the development of other human beings, how our culture has developed in the way it is. And from there I may think, okay, maybe take a little break from that, physiology. Let's take a look inside. What's happening in us, right? Why do we have the emotions that we have? Why is it some days I wake up and this is happening and that's happening to me? So you can take a little pause from that outer world, bring it back to them. What's happening in you? Do a little journal. Tell me what you're doing every day with your life. How is that impacting you? So reflect on yourself. Then maybe I'll take it back out again. Maybe we'll study physics and start looking at how the external phenomena around us operates. And so all through the year you're doing that flow. Also, through the seasons, you're looking at which main lessons actually work best in winter, which in autumn, which in the spring, because the children are drastically different in the autumn, the winter, and the spring. So, for example, this year I chose to do creative writing right before Christmas, the holiday seasons. And why is that? Because it's probably our most reflective, quiet time of the year. I know there's that hustle and bustle out there, but within ourselves, if you think where you're at in June and where you are in late December, it's a very different feeling within yourself, right? So you harness that. I wouldn't try to do a kind of soul-searching creative writing block in June. It would be totally insane. And I would get nowhere at all. However, in December, it's perfect. And they're in this reflective space where they can actually think about things in a very different manner. So every block is carved out thinking about the flow and the timing. And the timing is so important because if you don't get it right, that block will be wasted. So right now we're in a physics block. Why? Because winter's a good time to sit and really have that kind of focused thinking. Now when spring comes, maybe do a play block. It's nice, it's social, maybe a little history, but there are things that are more suited to that time of year, which then again has a completely different, very outward-looking experience to it. Another thing is within that is we also look at, the month, the week, even the day. So when I look at my month, I have usually my blocks for 3 to 4 weeks. I think of, okay, every month there's kind of a flow, and it's interesting if you ever want to do something for yourself and just notice where you're at, just track your moods and then kind of just track what's happening in the world around you. It does have effect. And so I kind of just think about, as the month flows through, and it's not, one can't do it perfectly all the time. It's just a general thought that is there. We have a general monthly rhythm that we kind of go through too. Within that, there's even a daily rhythm. So when I look at how I create a day or how a day is blocked out, there's a rhythm within a day. In the morning, there's a certain mood. In the afternoon, there's another mood. So if I'm going to do academic work, the best time to do it is straight away in the morning. By mid-afternoon, it's not good time. It's actually quite poor timing. They need actually to go out and do things. Practical arts is great. They can get engaged. They can use their hands. They can start engaging themselves much more in the will level. So all these things, all this timing is brought into Waldorf education and is brought into the planet. The other thing that is important is, as we go through the main lesson, I'm going to take the day and break it up into kind of main lesson and then your extra main lessons. So when we have a main lesson, the whole thing is also very consciously crafted. From the moment I shake hands in the morning. Well, why do I shake hands in the morning? Is it just some, hey, how's it going? No, it's actually a chance for me to check them in. The big thing we look for is the eye contact. If I get the eye contact, I mean, that's where our spirit lives, right? I know how they're doing that day. So that handshake is really important. If I see the class all coming in, it's a Monday, and they're all just like, I know already, okay, I'm kind of thinking I'm going to have to adjust my day a little bit because here we go, right? I don't have to get from the classroom, right? Also, it gives me a chance to check in and see how they're receiving me. If I'm feeling that distance when I go in to shake hands, maybe there was some misbehavior the other day I had to come down on a little bit. I want to see where our relationship is at. That handshake gives me that chance to do that, right? So it starts there, and then we go on this thing called, I think in the young years we call it morning circle. I just like to call it morning activity. Now, you can imagine it's 8:30, children are all coming in, I take attendance. If I plunged right into physics or creative writing at that point in time, I think we could all say that's pretty much game over. Not game over, but it'd be very difficult to get it going. So we have really this kind of warm up. And everything we do is actually, it's a warm up, but it's also developing certain capacities. So speech work. Speech work is really important because learning how to speak well, speak in front of groups of people, is a skill that they use their entire life. So starting from grade 1 all the way through, there are different speech exercises. It'll move on into drama work later. We do music. Why? Because music requires really listening to the whole group. Where the speech is much more about me, music is much more about the group. So I'm singing, I have to listen. Or I'm playing flute, I have to be able to keep the rhythm with the rest of the people that I'm playing with. And there's a very social aspect to playing music. Not to mention, it does wake you up because I have to look at the music that's being played, I have to get the right fingering down, I have to keep the tempo. All that is waking them up to be able to start engaging in that academic work without actually plunging right into that academic work right away. Other things we'll do is, once I do a little bit of artistic, do some speech work, we'll do some singing, and I'll do some mental math. Just quick questions, all right? What's this? What's that? Just every day. And it helps wake them up even more. And by the time you do all of that, now they're actually ready to start the proper main lesson. And you spend, generally a half an hour around there. In the younger grades, there's usually quite a bit of movement too, so it's really helping integrate, all of your senses or whatnot, and your body movements. And then when we have this main lesson, we have this called a 2-day rhythm. And what I will do is we will introduce material, and then just leave it there. Next day we'll come back, and then we'll do a review. Let it sleep for the night. I don't know what sleep does. They've actually done studies on it, and children that have that sleep and sleep on it, their learning is actually way faster than if they don't get those opportunities. So just drop it, bring it back next day. What do you remember? So after the warm-up, we'll do a review for 10 minutes. What do you remember from yesterday? How did that go? Out of that review, they'll have some work that they have to work on. So, for example, it may be, okay, we did an experiment yesterday on pulleys. All right, what were what was the procedure, observations, what conclusions can we draw from that? Okay, now everybody do their lab write-up from that. And so you give them some work time, which is kind of nice because they've had a little bit of movement, they've done some thinking, and now we're going to take that, and we're going to take what we just thought about, and we're going to put it immediately on the page. And this is kind of one of the other interesting things, is we have this thing called the main lesson book. Well, why is that main lesson book there? Well, you can think about what does it take to do that versus a textbook. The textbook, the information is already given. You can kind of just look at it, go, yeah, fill out the answers, move on, right? To do a main lesson actually requires, and the big thing is imagination. What do you want to do there? I give some general ideas. In grade 1, you're a little more specific. By grade 7, I give a sketch and say, this is what I want. Here's where you put in, this is where you add your touch at. So every page is actually a small piece of artwork that requires their own imagination and requires their own will. I have to really kind of reach in with myself and think, what do I want? It's a lot easier to fill out worksheets, right? In a certain sense. So we have that. After they've done that main lesson work, then what we'll do is we'll talk about the new material. So whatever, maybe do a new experiment. It may be a biography on somebody if you're in a history block. It may be talking about a different form of writing if you're in a creative writing block. And so you have this form that you're constantly repeating. And you do that for an entire month. And that's the other thing that's neat is we have this timing of 1 month because it's actually this nice flow where you begin, they really engage in it, and then you let it go to sleep. And what's even more interesting is every year you just circle around things. So maybe I'll introduce physics. We'll talk about heat this year. Next year we'll bring it back and we'll expand on it. And then we'll bring it back again and we'll expand on it. And what that does is it allows one to not say, this is what warmth is, or this is what heat is, and we're done forever. You just keep on bringing it back and circling around, and each time you just develop it a little bit more, and a little bit more. So maybe this year we're working on conclusions. Next year it's going to be putting the math into it. And then we'll move on and on up into high school. And what's nice about that is I've taught, I know the curriculum, and I can always tie that back into whatever block I'm talking about. So for example, if we're talking about mechanics, we're talking about planes or whatever it is. Remember in Egypt when they had the inclined plane and they used that to pull up the large blocks? Well, what's the physics? Why are they doing that? Why didn't they lift them straight up? Or, you can bring all that stuff in. And so you can actually, in a way, bring back their past main lesson experiences, tie it into these, and you also know this year what you're going to do. And you may even know it next year, so you can indicate, oh yeah, mechanics, actually, in the Industrial Revolution, we got really good at mechanics. We figured out how to use numbers to manipulate these basic, because people have used the inclined plane forever, or first-class levers. What they didn't have is the math to really manipulate these things. Well, that's what we've got really good at. Now engineers can do and create all these wonderful things. And we'll look at next year at the Industrial Revolution and think about, because people had the tools to bolt things together, we're actually able to make a lot more, because how did you hold something together before you had bolts and nuts? Well, it was pretty difficult. Right? So it takes these little simple things, and then you can just kind of interweave it and make it age appropriate, right? So that is how how the main lesson goes. And then you have the rest of the day. And what we talk about is, so that morning is really your thinking period. And they've done, there's actually a word for it, and I always forget what it is, but they've done studies on time and how people go through time, but they've noticed that your thinking is actually sharpest in the morning. And then there's another little window from about 7 to 9 o'clock at night. And so they actually recommend not doing homework after school, but waiting until 7 to 9. And actually for your own self doing work from about 7 to 9, because there's this other little window where you kind of wake up again and you're actually capable of doing more thinking type stuff. By about 11 o'clock, that starts wearing off and you enter into another phase. Well, we try to, once again, it's an ideal. I don't know, we can't always accomplish it, but it's nice to go into artistic work during that period of time. Whether it's music class, visual arts, give them a chance to live into that feeling realm a little bit, into mood, into gesture. That's what the artistic realm is. And then in the afternoon, you have another time frame, which is really that movement. Kind of take all that stuff you've got all morning and just get out there and move and work it into your system a little bit. So that's when you have your movement courses, PE, eurythmy, practical arts. Try to do that, schedule that as much as you can in the afternoon. Now, of course, when you've got 8th grades and teachers confinement and all that, we can't always accomplish that ideal, but that's the ideal. And then every day you've got this beautiful rhythm in the main lesson, and really it carries itself through the year. And the children are held in that because they know that there's just kind of a flow and a rhythm behind everything. And then you also just create this nice weaving in and out of themselves, and also through the different capacities that they have, which are really, they're just their thinking, their willing, and their feeling capacities. And you're just slowly nourishing them over time. So, once again, looking at consciousness, all those things are impacting and developing different capacities within yourself that help develop our humanity, which is the primary goal, in addition to, of course, the basics of academics. When one looks at some of these unique subjects, for example, eurythmy or form drawing or practical arts, one asks, well, Waldorf's kind of unique. Why do we do them? Now, I can't go into a too large a spiel, but I would like to just touch on them briefly and talk about why we do them. So form drawing is an interesting one that really only Waldorf schools have. And I know if many of you have been to parent nights where you've got to experience actually doing form drawing, but it's a very centering activity. So a lot of what it is creating symmetry and working with how lines develop, but more importantly, they're almost gestures of how things develop in the world around us. So plants, there's actually a physical gesture of how a plant develops. When you work in form drawing, you're actually capturing some of these fundamental gestures, and Gohlke called it metamorphosis. So you're looking at the metamorphosis of, and they actually have gone in, and if you look at how the human fetus develops, there's this very much kind of a in movement, outward movement, inward movement. There's these different basic gestures that exist in the development of the human embryo. In a way, those forces, and we just call them formative forces, are encapsulated whenever you're doing form drawing. The younger children have a natural sense for those because they're happening within their own body. And so what you're really getting them to do is work through these formative forces. And when you work with them, there's two things that happens. It really works on your imagination. But also, it requires this kind of centeredness because, it may be just symmetry lines. I want to have two lines going like there's a center line right here, and I'm trying to make them both the same. I mean, in your own mind, just kind of imagine, what does that take out of a second grader, out of a third grader, right? They really have to sit there and kind of find this nice quiet space within themselves and really focus on what that is. Well, of course, if they can do that and you practice that, it's developing a capacity that they're going to use in all their academic work. And most importantly, it's cultivating that quiet space. Because our quiet space is our creative space. It's where we let go of all the stuff floating around our head, focus on what's in front of us, and it's actually when the real stuff happens. Kind of when we shut down, right? And so it's helping them find that space, right? The same thing could be said with watercolor painting. Why do we do it? Because you're teaching them with qualities and gestures. So if I work with blue, there's a certain gesture. So when I do, Kandinsky actually did a lot of writing on this about the different, how you are drawn in or pushed away by different colors. But you develop a sensitivity towards moods and qualities. And I was going to bring it in, and I forgot it. There was this wonderful book that was just written by a couple who did all kinds of backcountry stuff north of Whistler. And in the back of the book, they talk about the imaginative landscape and be able to go across it and experiencing how these different landscapes actually have different qualities to them. And looking at the skies in the different days and be able to not just walk through the landscape like do, but actually taking in these beautiful gestures of the landscapes around them. In a way, when you're watercolor painting, it's like looking up at the sky and seeing that perfect sunrise with those bright oranges and all that. It has an impact on you just as much as seeing that beautiful white snow has a different quality to it, right? Imagine going through your life and having that experience versus nothing at all, right? So these are part of the things that we're trying to accomplish by doing this. You with me? Same thing is when I move with a group of people and I have to be conscious and we're all moving together, what does that require of me as a second, third, fourth grader? Also, if I'm listening to a piece of music and I want to create a gesture of that within my own being, what do I have to do? How can I bring that music alive within myself and portray it through my physical body? Once again, it's developing these kind of sensitivity towards moods, gestures, and when we work with human beings, you're always working with gesture and mood. Because what we say is 99% of the time not actually what's going on inside of us, right? There's a whole mood and gesture behind everything we do and everything we say. And cultivating that capacity to feel those and navigate people is actually probably one of the higher aspects of when they call it soft skills. Well, that's really what a soft skill is, isn't it? It's having that sensitivity to mood and gesture in all the people that live around us and how do I work with them, right? Well, that's what the arts are helping you cultivate all the time. And then we have handwork. Well, why handwork? Well, big thing is, first of all, is if you've ever watched little children, and it's funny, I've got the 3-year-old and the 6-year-old at school, they have these hands that just seem to not really be so finely maneuverable, right? And then you have to get them to start writing, and by doing all these fine movements, it's actually helping develop, simple, fine motor skills. And it's teaching them how to focus. They're learning how to count on patterns. There's a lot of simple things that are going on, and eventually that'll lead into designing their own clothing. Well, getting a sense for what's aesthetic, what's beautiful. So if I'm in 7th grade design my own pajamas, okay, Once again, you're back into imagination. What do I want them to look like? Why do I want them to look that way? What's going to look nice together, right? It's coming out of them. And I think that's the big thing, is it's always asking them to dig in. You know, what do you have in there? What do you want to bring to the table? Same with practical arts. Okay, maybe you make a toy in grade 7. Well, I teach the skills, but ultimately, how do you want to design it? How do you want to work with it? What's your imagination? What skills do you need to do that? So all that stuff is done to help promote that imagination, and then also just get them to, you know, sit and process. Because sometimes even when I've thought a lot about something, you just need to let go of it, go for work, go work in the garden, right? And guess what? Something happens, and then all of a sudden you'll be sitting there gardening, forgot about what you got to do, and it's like, oh, that's it. And something clicks, right? So those are all kind of the gestures that exist in that. Just trying to be conscious of my time here. So moving on, so that's the system, and there's more to it, but it gives you a rough sketch of the system, why he set up the way it is, and you know, in a way I could say it's quite unique, and it's really coming out of his own studies of the impact, and everything has impact on our consciousness. How much we're aware of it, that's a different question, but it does. Even, you know, I always have this as a simple example of people. Look out a window, and I've done both, and have a cityscape in front of you. And then look out a window and have mountains and trees in front of you. It is a totally different experience. I don't know what it is, but one, you just kind of stream out into it and you're there, and you can't do it in a city landscape. You just can't. It impacts you day after day being in a cityscape. I'm not saying that cityscapes are bad, but it has a certain impact on you. That, you know, looking at a natural landscape has another impact on you, right? And it's just developing sensitivities toward these things because they all affect us. And we're trying to create as much health as we can. And the way we do that is by being aware of how things impact our consciousness. So, moving on from that is the role of the teacher. Now, this is a tricky part, and I'm not going to kid you. You can have the most amazing system in the world, but it also requires pretty interesting human beings to be able to implement that system. And, you know, I've been teaching now for probably 20 years, and I've seen lots of different people teach. And what's interesting is when you get somebody in front of a group of children, they're totally different groups of children depending upon who that person is. And it really comes down to who that person is. And then that's an interesting thing. So what is it? What is it that the children are actually really responding to? Because they're responding to something is there. We can't see it, yet again, they're feeling it and responding to it because they're just little, they're like that. They're still kind of tuned into things more than we are. The problem is they're just not conscious of it, right? So as Waldorf teachers, there's some kind of fundamental things, there are fundamental things that have been given to us to help us out a little bit. And Steiner talks about how in our soul life, we live in what he calls sympathy and antipathy, which means, oh, we really like that. Oh, that drives me crazy. I hate that. And we get caught in this tidal wave of back and forth of our emotional life swinging between these two extremes. And you can imagine walking in the classroom with all these children, all these parents behind these children. And if I caught into that sympathy and antipathy, especially teaching 7th graders, oh my gosh, my poor little ship is going to get sunk like in 2 seconds. So he gives what he calls the 6 subsidiary exercises to all teachers. And you get them in training right away. And really what they are is to help you get a hold of all of those pulling forces of sympathy and antipathy that live within us and just be able to sit back, and I think in our culture we just call it not react, right? I want to go into respond, not react mode. That's all it is. It's pretty simple. There's 6 of them. I'll just give you a couple. I mean, one is as simple as developing your concentration, which means you take a chopstick and you think about that chopstick for 10 minutes every day. You think about how it was manufactured, how people use it. And you just try to keep really focused concentration on something as simple as that. That's it. That's one activity. Another one is a will activity. Every day at 12, you're going to churn the ring on your finger. But you're going to do it every day at 12 o'clock. You think, oh, that's easy. Okay. Give that a go, right? It's really hard. And you need that kind of consistency of the students, right? Like if I can't stay on top of it, be consistent every day, they're going to wear me out. I'm sure as parents you've had that experience too, because they'll sit there and smash against you over, and you have to have an indomitable will, because they'll win otherwise, because they do have an indomitable will. And you can imagine all 20 of them just going, "Courage, courage," and you just have to be like, "I can take it." Another one is positivity. So even no matter what you think, you can look at that, and he has this example of dead carcass of a dog on the street, and you look at it and think, "Oh, that's pretty gross." But then you look at the dog's tooth, and you think, "Oh, actually, that is so amazingly beautiful." So no matter how rough the situation may be, you can look at it and say, there's good in there, right? There's something, because it's hard to do. It's hard not to get lost in that, right? Another one is just openness. So, his example is somebody tells you that the church tower is sitting at a 90-degree angle, and you just go, "Huh, that's interesting. I'm going to check it out for myself." You don't say no. You don't say, "That's impossible. It couldn't possibly be." You say, "Okay, interesting. I'm going to check it out." Because you've got to stay open. Because you've got 20 children with all their stuff going on, and who knows? And every one of them is unique, and they're bringing different things that you haven't experienced before. So I have to be like, "Well, okay, I haven't seen that one before. Let's see what happens," right? So those are all qualities that we as teachers have to cultivate that are really important. And then the other one, there's some other exercises, but the fundamental qualities are, and I think it's even as adults we need this. He talks about judgment. How do we, every day I'm making so many judgments. You're looking at a child, something happened, I'm measuring what's my response, how am I going to respond to that, how's that going to impact the entire class? All these thoughts have to go through your head. You have to react very quickly. And I'm sure all of you in your work conditions are doing the same things, right? How can we refine and increase our ability to make good judgments, right? That's one. So there's exercises for that. The other one is care and interest. If we go through the world with no care or interest, it has real impact. And in fact, if I was in the classroom with no care and interest, I'd be in there for about half a second before that entire class would boot me out, right? So how is it that we can develop care and interest for our colleagues, the students, the parents, everything, even when it's less than charming, because it is at times, right? Stick with it and stay with it, right? Another one is, and it's an interesting word in our culture, it's morality. And morality has been given this kind of bad, people like using the word ethical instead of moral. I'm like, well, you can be ethical and not be moral. Ethical are just a set of outward rules that are imposed upon you. Morality is not good or bad. That's the label that's been put on it. It's actually from our own selves. Can we see how our reactions are creating health or unhealth in ourselves and people around them? A moral response is a healthy response. So in the classroom, it's seeing something and knowing that's what I have to do. And it may be that hard conversation with a colleague or parent or whatever it is, or the child, and saying, I have to do this. That's our moral responsibility. And you know that that's going to create health, because if you don't deal with it, it's only going to get worse. And it's that little voice inside you that more often than not, you're like, shut up, oh, or better yet, I should listen to that voice. And you don't. And so but that voice inside knows that, and it knows how to create health, and it's slowly tuning into that. So as a teacher, we're asked to work on exercises. So for example, as a full faculty right now, we're doing a study on practical thinking, which is really just how to fine-tune your judgments. And there's a bunch of exercises in there, how to increase your capacity to make proper judgments. And one of the things is simply watching a situation, instead of thinking, oh yeah, I know what's going to happen with that. That always happens. Just saying, oh, I don't know. I think this might happen. And then watch what actually really happens. See how accurate your judgments really are. Because they may be less than we actually think they are in a lot of terms. And so it's holding back just a little bit and just saying, yeah, is it accurate? Moving on. And another set of faculties that we're asked to really have, and one is enthusiasm. We have to have enthusiasm for our work, which means it's tough. Every day you wake up, you're going to be facing, 20 people, and there's not a break from that, because you have to hold them. Like, even if I'm at school, I have to have them in my mind, because if I'm not, it starts going sideways really quickly. It's interesting, they know it in a certain way. So you're always kind of, even when you're here, maybe I'm not in the class, my mind is kind of always living there a little bit, right? So you need that enthusiasm, humor is incredibly important. In fact, the older they get, the more you need to have humor. And part of it is humor towards yourself. Can you joke about yourself on occasion, make fun of some of your quirks? Because if you don't, they're going to find it and make fun of it for you. So you might as well do it yourself. It's true. It's sad, but it's true. Another one is acquired idealism, which means, the ideal really is striving for our own humanity, thinking that's possible. In our world, in our day and age, it's actually, there's a question mark. I mean, if you really look at the higher levels of academia, is humanity something, or are we just biological animals, pre-programmed to pursue our basic needs? There is that view out there. It is very much a living paradigm, and you could say a lot of different systems are cultivated around that view of a human being. It's ideal to think that society or human beings are going to develop themselves. And yet, I believe, and the reason why I'm in Waldorf education is because I believe it is possible, and it's actually the most noble calling of it's what we're here for, really, is to continue to develop our humanity. Why? I don't know. Don't have any answers for it. I just feel, I know it's possible because I've seen people that can do it. I've seen great examples, and I'm like, it just seems like that's what we're here for. And holding on to that ideal, even when it's rough, right? Because it's easy to let go of it, just like, I'm just out for me, right? So having that, but sticking with it, the children feel that on some deeper level, right? Another one is language, which means not just the way we speak, but what's actually being given to the children through our language. So I may be talking about something, I may be talking about science, I may be talking about physics, but they sense, and I may be talking about the use of technology, right? They know whether I'm talking about it, and I could just be talking about the science of it. They pick up on my mood as to whether I'm okay with that, or I'm not okay with that. Or am I okay with them, or I'm not okay with them. I may say I'm okay with them, but they pick up on those moods and gestures and language. So it's being conscious with our language all the time and making sure that what we say actually aligns with what we feel. And that's difficult. And we have to do that with our colleagues. If we do that, that creates health in the institution as a whole. Do we always do that? No. And we're all a work in progress, right? So those are kind of the basic qualities one's looking for in a teacher. And I think it's that constant striving for that is what's expected out of a Waldorf teacher. Of course, one has to know how to do all the basics of teaching, which is classroom management and structuring out how am I going to do my math program and all that. But ultimately, that's not what's speaking to the children. That's not what's going to allow you to teach them for 7 years or whatever it is in the Waldorf system. It's that inner striving and working on those things. And that's what's actually going to live in them. It's not all the information you've taught to them. It's the experience of you as a person and your own striving of humanity that is actually the greatest example. Talk is cheap at the end of the day. It's who we are and who we are in front of the classroom. And that's a big responsibility, they're looking at us as teachers and as parents to, how do we handle that? Because that's where they're going to get their idealism from, or how they're going to respond to the world. So that's the role of the teacher and who we are, and it's a responsibility, for sure. So moving on, the last aspect is the students, and that is really, looking at, even with the most amazing system, the most amazing teachers, we still are finite in our capacities. And I always, I have this rough percentage in my mind with absolutely no evidence whatsoever at all. But I always feel like, for us, it's about 50%. What we can do with that child is 50%. That other 50% we have to be met by, the parent body as a whole. And there's some simple things at home that one can do, and it's not huge and onerous, but they're things that help us help your student, right? And some of them are as simple as having that rhythm. So everything we do here is based on rhythm, and that rhythm carries them. And I tell people, just imagine when you take rhythm out of your life. You're on holiday and you've got zero going on, there's no structure, no rhythm. What happens to you? You start getting kind of sleepy and lethargic, and it's hard to self-motivate, and pretty soon you just start going sideways, right? Well, that's us as adults. As children, it's even worse. So that rhythm helps carry them on their day-to-day basis, just like it does with us as adults. I'm glad I got to go to work, because if I had to go to work, I don't know what would happen to me if I sat at home for a while. It'd be rough going. I may have beer down to here. Another one is sleep. Sleep is so important because it's where we actually do all the processing at, right? During the daytime, we're getting hit by sense impressions all the time. You're getting bombarded, right? You have to digest those. Where does that happen at? That happens during your sleep time, right? It gives that chance for everything to kind of shut down and process, right? Shut the computer down, let it process. If it doesn't have processing time and it can't digest it, it stays undigested, and then you start getting little tics, maybe even little anxieties, right? Just imagine not sleeping. What happens to you? You start getting little tics and anxieties, because that's probably what happens to me, right? You just start getting quirky, right? And the children are far more sensitive than us, so you just think of how does it impact you? It's worse for them, right? Another one is clear boundaries. Even for us, if we're in a workplace and we know exactly what my boundaries are, we know what the expectations are, I work a lot better. I don't like having, oh yeah, it's all good, you can do whatever you want. I'm like, no, I need to know what my job is, what I'm supposed to get done, what am I striving for. I don't want amorphous nothing, right? So for the children, it's the same. They want to know. They want to be held accountable. Of course, they're going to complain. I complain about it. Oh, do I have to really get reports in? You know? But ultimately, it's important and it's good for us, right? With that also is appropriate consequences. So, you know, if you have the clear expectations, you have appropriate consequence, and then it's that indomitable will of just sticking with it, saying, we agreed on that, this is what the consequence is, and just staying on top of that. They will thank you. They won't thank you, but they will. There's part of them that actually really loves it, and you just have to look at that part and forget the part that's complaining. Because it does. It's amazing, but there's a deep appreciation, and they're actually looking for you to do that for them, even though they complain. So once again, you have to look at them and just not hear what's coming out of their mouth, but seeing what actually they really do want, right? And it's hard to do, because sometimes they're screaming and yelling, it's hard to look past it. I had that issue too. So, you know, other ones are, you know, basic. It's the food that we put in. Of course, there's things that create health. You know, our society is really good at having a better sense of that. Communication. What examples of communication do we set with each other? Are we clear and open communications with each other? Even the parent-teacher communication. Is that healthy? Because that's what they're looking for. How are we modeling that for them, right? Another one is, I call it healthy sensory input. What's interesting is, in that book I was talking about, Steiner, at the very beginning, he wrote this book about consciousness, and what he really talks about is the sense world and my inner world, and how they meet, right? And how it affects consciousness. And so what we want to do for children is create as much healthy sensory impressions as we possibly can. And what I mean by that is, you know, a simple example, if they're seeing violence, that has impact on their inner life that they will live with their entire life. It actually, that sensory experience goes on and it lives in them, right? If they live in, you know, I mean, they have studies of children that lived in refugee camps, right? And what they have, I mean, that's a sensory input. They're seeing the pain, the suffering, all that must exist in a refugee camp. I've never been, but I can only imagine. How do they, that lives on in them. And then they have to spend a lot of time working through those images, right? So how do we as parents and schools create healthy sensory input for them, right? And that's a big one. And it has multiple, and it's, media is not bad. It's the sensory impressions that they're getting from the media. And it's the amount of it, right? My children watch TV, you know? Do I have them watching violence when they're around people? No. That's not a healthy sensory impression for them, right? Watching a nice nature show on occasion, sure, that's great, right? It's not a terrible thing for them. And so that's the question. And so whenever we're exposing them to anything, it's thinking, what's the sensory impression there? And is it making them healthier or is it not, right? And the final thing is warmth. We all need, most importantly, warmth. And they've actually done studies on children that don't get warmth, basically love. And and their development is super slow, if they even survive at all. So they did studies on these children were living in homes in China that basically just got stuck in a crib, got food, everything they need to survive, and yet didn't, because there was no warmth in their life, right? So how is it that we give them that warmth to help them thrive? And you can think of yourself being in a cold environment, what happens to you? You can feel things start to shut down, right? At the same time, if it gets too warm, that's not necessarily good either, right? There's a happy balance in there. And speaking of dualities, I think one of the biggest challenges for parents and ourselves is there's this interesting dichotomy, and everything ultimately is a balance. We have to have enough confidence in ourselves and what we're doing to move forward. At the same time, we have to have enough doubt in ourselves to stay open. And that is so incredibly difficult to do, because we either fall into, oh, I know what I'm doing, I've got it down, or I have no idea, what am I possibly going to do, right? When we're parenting or we're teaching, right? And it's trying to notice yourself, fall into the eye, say, you know what, I'm just going to stay open, stay reflective, I'm going to try to work through it, and be okay with it, right? And not let myself have the easy out, which is, I know it all, I don't know anything, right? So those, that's the basic gesture as a parent that really helps us. And if we're all doing that, that's actually Waldorf education. And that's all of us combining together to create, humans who are going to go out in the world and actually bring health. They're going to work with people. They're going to have their own families. And they're going to bring a degree of health in our society. And you could say, if anything, what's going to change the world is not politicians or CEOs implementing some new system from high in their temple somewhere. It's every one of us in our day-to-day actions creating health. And there's this big Lord of the Rings fan, but it's a nice metaphor, because he talks about how the days of the kings are gone. And it's actually the Frodos of the world. And who's Frodo? It's actually just a metaphor for us. It's the age of Frodo. It's no longer the age of kings. Nobody's going to solve, no technocrat, no amazing politicians are going to solve our issues. It's all of us working in our day-to-day lives that are going to bring health to the world. There is no other solution. And you can't make it systematic. There's nothing I could do. Even if I became president or prime minister, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know what laws I could implement that are going to bring health. Because policies and laws don't bring health. People do. Right? So, anyway, I wanted to just finish off with that, because I thought it was just a nice picture of Waldorf education and what we're trying to do here. And then it still leaves us 15 minutes for questions, so I'm perfectly on time. So I know it's a lot of information, but any questions, I can't promise that I have an answer or anything, but I will try my best. If I can't, I'll say I don't. Go for it.
Am I sitting on your lessons for a turn?
Well, there are open houses. You find out if I'm doing one, you can come and sit in one of my main lessons, absolutely.
I was just wondering, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, for me, this is amazing information to get from you, so thank you. I'm sure the 12 of us that are here would agree. And that's actually part of my question. So you were just talking at the end about what parents can do and sort of creating that part of the student that's really helpful.
Yep.
And there's 12 of us from 8 families here, and there's 100 plus families at the school, so maybe 10% are actually going to get this information from you. Some might have it from elsewhere, but I don't believe that many do.
Yep.
So my question is, how does that affect you as a teacher in terms of having potentially 10% of your students in this kind of a routine, or having parents who at least have some knowledge of this, and 80% or is it 50, or is that an issue, I guess is my question.
I think it's, it's the long game, right? So one has to look at, we do have parent nights, right? I think it's part of a class teacher's responsibility, or, early years lead teachers down there to educate ourselves. And that's the other thing about teacher I didn't mention is ongoing study of child development, so that, and our understanding of Waldorf education, so that we can, when we understand enough ourselves, and we're not just throwing out the lingo, because there's lots of lingo in Waldorf education, but we actually have lived with it and worked with it and studied it. It lives in us, and then we can communicate it, and I think it does have more impact like that. And so you have parent nights, and I think it's also looking at a school and slowly creating a culture, right? It takes time to create a culture. It really does. And it takes people that want to help create that culture, and it may start small, right? Any small change is done by a few people, and it's that consistent staying on top of it and working on it, and then over time you do create a culture. And once you create that, people come into it, and you kind of get a sense of it, and you start doing it almost naturally, right? But you've got to build that, and it takes time, and it's a reasonably new school to that extent, and that's going to take some time to develop, and that's part of that patience and that kind of indomitable will of just stay at it. And if it's 10 people, well, it's 10 people. Maybe those 10 people go and talk to some other people, and then next time maybe it's more, or parent nights, or whatever it is, right? It's a drop of water in a bucket. And it does have impact, for sure. Yeah.
But for your class, when you have your parent nights, you are giving this kind of a talk, so I think for your class parents, they would get that anyway, rather than having to come to a special night.
I don't know, Gina. Was it different than parent night?
Totally different.
Yeah.
I knew it.
Diane, you're there too, right? I try to really bring.
Prayer meeting on Monday, 5th of November.
Big Waldorf.
I try to bring different angles, and I think it's what the center does brilliantly. He actually never tells you anything. He just characterizes. So you have to go around, circle it, and it really makes you deepen your understanding of things. Because he never says, "Oh, it's just like this." He actually just sits there and paints pictures.
Yeah, like I found the parent night to be much more logistical.
Yeah.
This is much more theoretical. This is more developmental.
Yeah.
How would you define
And it's fine.
But how does
They're so fine, but
how does Diane define humanity, if you would? Put it into words.
I think probably the best example is a Jungian example, because it's one we know in our culture is, and Jung actually spends a lot of time talking about a truly modern person, which means an individuated person, which means I am not taking my meaning or how I'm going to live from my culture around me. It's actually coming out of myself. So it's as simple as basically become an artist of your own life, right? I'm not painting the way I was taught by my teacher. I actually have reached that point where I'm doing my own painting and living creatively in my own life, responding to what's happening around me. So I'm working on artwork. I may be working on it, oh yeah, I need to do this, I need to do that. It's not rules that have been taught to me. I'm actually living dynamically into the moment, into what's happening in front of me. Because all the time, that sensory input, it's weird, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but once you kind of let go of all the stuff in your head, and you just kind of live in quiet a little bit, things start speaking, and you just kind of know, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to go there, I need to do this, right? That's individuation, because you're not taking rules anymore. It's not culture saying. And when part of the reason I went to Asia is because I went to Europe in university, and I got deconstructed, right? I mean, I was an American, and I'm not going to deny, I grew up in the heartland of America, and I was American as they came. Played football, I had a 1967 Mustang, went cruising on the weekends. I mean, it was like archetypal American experience. I went there and got deconstructed, and I was like, oh, I mean, the Germans are just ruthless too. They think Americans are dumb. I'm going to put it that way, and they just felt the need to deconstruct me. And then I thought, I want to step way outside of Western culture. I want to go and view myself in Eastern culture and get a whole nother perspective on reality. I think the last thing I like to do is actually step out of modern culture and step into a pre-technical society just to get another perspective. Because you don't realize how many things you have until they've been deconstructed. And living in Asia was brilliant for that, because it was just like, oh wow, everything. They have nothing in common. Like, there's no historical commonality at all. So parenting, education, everyththing you can think of across the board, totally different set of expectations. And you don't speak the language, so you kind of just walk around going, I have no idea. And once you learn the language, it's okay, but you have to be able to read people. You have to become almost like a little baby again and go, they seem like they're really nice. I don't have any way to judge. I can't even judge what class they're in. Like, now we look at people and how much information we can get, the way they dress, the way they handle themselves. You know what, social class, right? I couldn't really do that, right? Because it's so foreign. But it was kind of cool, right? Anyway, sorry, that was way too much.
I gave this pre-technical time machine.
Yeah. Go up north. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you cool down the class if we need it in a way too? Otherwise, they are
Yeah, it's really simple.
That is?
That's what I do. I will stand there and wait, and they will calm themselves down. But you can't stand there and wait and go, all right, everybody, be quiet. You really have to be like, I'm waiting for you, and we're doing important stuff. But it's all the stuff that you're doing when they're not quiet that gives you the power to be quiet. Because they know you're actually doing the best thing for them, and they're learning, and they're growing, and that gives you the power. It's not, I walk in their first day, I do that, it works. No. It's, I've worked with them, they develop trust in you, and they know that they're growing, and they know they actually want to develop themselves, and they'll quiet down for you because of that. Strange, but it's true.
And so that should work at home?
You know, it's interesting. Just, it's a totally different atmosphere. But I do find if they get a little bit excited, if you just find that calm spot, maybe sit down on the sofa and just really calm yourself down, maybe pick up a book, that energy does kind of feed itself up. But once again, it's not what you're doing when you're quiet, it's all the work that you're doing with them when you're not being quiet that helps them do that. That makes sense. And it's relationship stuff, right? And every little thing you do in the classroom is building relationship or taking away from it, right? Building health in the classroom. So you're conscious of every little thing. And the thing is, you'll miss something someday and you'll be like, oh. And it's weird because you'll be in the classroom like, right now, I need to go ask this person how they're doing. If you're really paying attention. Because when you're really teaching, you're out there, right? You're out there sensing all the time. You're like, oh, I need to go talk to that person. And you touch in with them and you built something there. You don't know what it did, but you know it was an important thing to do. Right? And all those little things are all the time building up the classroom, right? And it's weird, like if you're having a sick day where you can't do that, it's hard, and all you can do is rely on the times that you haven't, that you've done that, and they'll forgive you and let you get away with it for a day or two if you're feeling a little bit low, but not much more than that. And I'm sure as you as parents have experience, you get to cut a little bit of slack, but it's not a pile. Any other questions? Anyway, thank you for coming. Like I always hope that people walk away with just some thoughts, some inspiration, things that they're like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. And you know, if something ever comes across you, I love theorizing and just kind of talking about stuff and thinking about stuff. If you have a question, hey, I don't know if I'll answer for it, but I'm happy to talk about it. Anyway, so I think what the idea was is that we'd have these last little 10, 15 minutes just to kind of socialize or whatever. If you had a question you wanted to ask me on the side, I'm more than happy to do that. The only thing I will say, if it's an actual, I always say this, is I can't, if it's a specific situation, I don't know the specifics, I'm not in that. All I can do is say, generally speaking, this, right? Specifics you can't answer because I'm not part of it. I haven't seen it. I'm not involved in it. I don't know, right? I can only speak generally about things, if that makes sense, right? Because you're not in it and you're not involved in it. It's not my energy. It's other people's energy, and I don't know it. So, anyway, thank you very much for
Thank you.